for get some benefit from there, even though that's not it's not perfect. Because neither solution is perfect. But the other one is that where we are sleeping, you need to have light in for Shalom Bayit, as we've discussed, and therefore that light you'll benefit from when you go back into the room after the meal on Friday night. So you light there because it's an electric light. We don't say a bracha, we're concerned, but in order to cover both aspects, to have in mind turning on that electric light, that's part of my Adlakat Nerot, and then go light the candle in the lobby and then say the bracha, and that way there's not such a bracha. It was actually when we got there, the lights were on. So turn the light off, turn them on. That's something.
Which stuff are you on?
Which stuff am I? We're going to start on page 193.
Of which, like of the.
There's a new file. I sent it. It's in the drive. It should say Tefillot Shabbat. That's the one. So the Ramban has a famous letter called Igeret HaRamban, right? The letter of the Ramban, which he wrote to his son, I think it was. And one of the things he says there at the end, he said he gives him different pieces of advice for life. He tells him to be careful how he speaks, not to get angry, things. And he says, whenever you learn, when you get up from the sefer, you should look for something practical to implement. It shouldn't be you're just learning something for the sake of it. You should find how it should come alive. So that is just one example of Tzurba Rabbanan coming alive. Okay, we are now on the fifth shir in volume 16. I'm happy to announce, by the way, volume 17 has been completed and has been published and has been printed. So we will get to that in due course. But we're still working our way through volume 16. We've discussed Hadlakat Nerot Shabbat. We've discussed Tosefet Shabbat. We're now into Shabbat. We're going to talk about the Tefillot of Shabbat. Okay, a little bit different today and next week in terms of not talking so much about the halachot, the melachot of lighting candles and kiddush and things like that. But there's a lot to talk about of the tefillot that we say on Shabbat. There are a number of differences, trying to understand what it is precisely that we're saying, why we're saying it. Some practical ramifications come out as well. So we're going to work through chronologically. We start on page 193, talking about mincha of Erev Shabbat. Okay, and the Torah tells us in source number 1, Nichnasin lebeit hakneset umitpalelin tefillat mincha kmo b'shar yomot achot. Okay, so mincha, Erev Shabbat, Friday afternoon. Because one can daven earlier on Friday afternoon, but generally speaking, it's easier to daven mincha at shul just before Kabbalat Shabbat. One exception might be on Chanukah, right? Shabbat Chanukah, we have an early minyan so that we can daven mincha first, then go home, light candles, come back. But in any event, we daven mincha, the normal, regular weekday mincha, except there is no tachanun. Tachanun, which we don't recite, of course, on Shabbat and Yom Tov and certain festival days, but on Erev Shabbat as well, we don't say tachanun. Now, this is based on, in part, the Gemara source number 2, Masechet Moed Katan. The Gemara over here is discussing the laws of Avelut. Now, one of the dinim of Avelut in Shiva is that the beds they had in the times of the Gemara were a little bit different to the beds that we have. I don't know exactly how it looked, but they would turn over the beds or collapse the beds. There was something which they would do as part of their mourning, and they would lift the beds back up when Shiva was over. So it says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, me'ematai zokfin et hamitot be'erev Shabbat, because on Shabbat there is no mourning as well. But when would or if this is the end of the period, when would you raise the beds on Friday? And the answer is mina mincha ulamala, i.e., we don't wait until Shabbat comes in. It's a little bit earlier on. It's a few hours before. And there's an idea, that the kedusha of Shabbat, even before our Tosefet Shabbat, but the kedusha of Shabbat extends towards Friday afternoon, and that is going to be why we don't say tachanun as well. Now, the Levush writes in source number 3, he says, because we generally recite mincha close to the onset of Shabbat. So what if you daven mincha earlier in the day? You daven mincha gedola. Nonetheless, we say that we don't say tachanun. We also don't say al naharot bavel. You can see the Mishnah Berurah number 4. When read it inside, but he also says if somebody has lunch on, obviously we discussed having a meal on Erev Shabbat, what you can have, when you can have it. But there you would say Shira Malot already on Friday afternoon. Now, an interesting case that does come up, and that's how we spoke before about Tosefet Shabbat. We spoke about what to do with Mincha, what happens when the Tzibur is davening late, and you're going to finish Mincha only after Shkia already. How do you do Tosefet Shabbat? Should you daven Mincha earlier, etc.? Here's the opposite question. What about a case where the Tzibur is fine? The Tzibur davens Mincha right on time, but and they're going to finish before with enough time for Tefillot Shabbat, but you come late to Shabbat on Friday afternoon. It's never happened to anybody here. But somebody comes late to shul on Friday afternoon, and you need to daven mincha still, but the tzibur is already accepted. They've already accepted Shabbat. So there, one would not be able to stand in the shul, which has already accepted Shabbat, and then daven mincha. You would have to daven outside, and that's what it says in Surah number 5. Right, okay, that's what we said before, that we should daven mincha on Erev Shabbat should finish at least a few minutes before Shkia. And you see in source number 6, he says, they daven early, they began to fulfill Tefillot Shabbat, they've accepted it, you have not yet daven mincha, you can still daven mincha, even by yourself, right? It doesn't start at the for one to daven mincha in a shul where they've already accepted Shabbat. So you should go outside, go downstairs, whatever it may be.
Is that actually like Beracha though? Like we're talking like in the Kabbalat Shabbat already? Like what's the line there? Sachakol.
Yeah, it's where the tzibur has already accepted Shabbat.
Right, defined how?
Okay, so either by so depending on the minhag, we've said before, it's either we go by Mizmor Shir Yom Shabbat, Yom Chadodi, or by Baruch.
Right.
Okay, if the tzibur is already on Baruch when you're davening mincha, you've got other problems, but you should try not to be that late. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Kabbalat Shabbat. Now, what's fascinating about Kabbalat Shabbat is the following: the source for this, not necessarily the Mizmorim that we say, that our structure of the Siddur, but the concept of going out early to greet the Shabbat, right, as we say in the Chadodi. So this is based on the Gemara Shabbat. We're on page 196, source number 7, says the Gemara Masechet Shabbat, Rabbi Hanina mi'atef v'kaya panya d'malei shabtan. Right, Rabbi Hanina would wrap himself up in his talit and he would stand at nightfall, or in his garment, whatever it was. He would stand at nightfall on Friday night, and he would say, Amar bo netzeh likrat Shabbat HaMalka. Let us go out to greet the Shabbat Queen. Rabbi Yanai lavish manei. Rabbi Yanai also would put on his garment malei Shabbat. V'amar boi kala. So then, of course, the words of boi kala in the Chadodi are based on this Gemara. And we see this idea of Rabbi Hanina, Rabbi Yanai going out early to greet the Shabbat. That is the concept of Kabbalat Shabbat. The formula, the exact nusach of Kabbalat Shabbat is something fascinating because it is a relatively late addition to our Siddur. We're talking about the 16th century, the Mekubalim in Tzfat, and generally speaking with the Siddur, okay, so the further back you go, the more common it will be amongst different Eidur, right? Ashkenaz, Nusach Sfarad, Eidut HaMizrach, etc. Certain things, the central core of the Tefillah goes back, it's the same, everybody says the same, more or less. Later additions, as you go forward, we find much greater discrepancy. So Slichot, for example, which are, the particular Slichot that we say are much later, even, amongst the Ashkenaz, you have Minhag Polin, and you have Minhag Lita, and you have, if you're an Ashkenazi, you've ever tried to do Slichot with the Sephardi, it's very, very difficult. It's completely different. These are things which are added in much later. Kabbalat Shabbat, it's amazing. It was added in very, very late, and yet it is almost universal amongst all the different Ashkenaz, Sfarad, etc. The tune might be a little bit different, but the words that we say, the particular Mizmorei Tehillim, were accepted by everybody. That's quite a remarkable thing.
Now, what does it mean to go out and greet the Shabbos? How does that work?
Well, the way that we do it now is that we say these Mizmorim, and then we turn around at the end of the Chadodi, we turn around, we face the entrance to the shul, and say Boi b'Shalom, accept the Shabbat inside. They would go outside. There were places where they actually went outside. That seems to be when you see what the Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Yanai, they would go out into, potentially go out into the field. I don't know, but that is the way that we do it now. We'll see later on. We're going to discuss Birkat Mein Sheva, Magen Avot. And we see from there, it used to be in the times of the Gemara, and even later on, the shul was not in the middle of the city. The shul was out in the field. It was out in a dangerous place. We'll get to that as well. So source number 8 is the Piskei Teshuvot, who tells us, Ma'arash al-Kabetz, right? Rabbi Shlomo al-Kabetz, who was one of the Mekubalim of Tzfat, and the teacher of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, and this was in the company of the Arizal, and that esteemed group. So he wrote the piyut lechadodi. Again, piyutim by their nature, as I said, generally speaking, piyutim are added in much later to the siddur. It's really a unique phenomenon that this piyut was accepted by everybody across the board. מסיים בסופו בלשון חז"ל בו יחלה, ומזמורי לכו נענה, etc. אין מוזכר בכתבי העליב על המק, אלא עודכן אמירתן בזמן תלמידי העליז. Okay, so this was the students of the Arizal who added in all of these mizmorim, which we now say, which is from Lechun Na'an onwards. ונתפשט אמירתם בכל תפוצות ישראל. And this has become a universal institution to say. Now there is another passage which not every community says, that is Kagavna, which is a passage from the Zohar that is said in Nusach Sfarad, that was established by, he says here, by the students of the Baal Shem Tov. In Nusach Sfarad, I would say, truth is in Eretz Israel, it's more common than it would be in Chutz La'aretz, but that's regarding Kagavna, it's not our minhag to say it here. The Gemara in Masechet Brachot number 9 talks about this. It says, "Hanei sheva de Shabbat keneged mi," that on Shabbat we say 7 brachot. What do you mean 7 brachot? When we say the Shmona Esrei, which means 18, it's ironic because we never ever say 18 brachot in the Shmona Esrei, even though we call it 18. During the week we actually say 19 because there was an additional bracha which was added. On Shabbat and Yom Tov we say 7, right? On Rosh Hashanah we say 9. We have the additional ones, and that is why some people call it the Amidah, which is the standing prayer, which is a more correct name, but nonetheless, Shmona Esrei is okay. Sometimes regarding Shabbat, people call it Tefillot Shabbat, but you might still say Shmona Esrei, okay, but we know what we mean. But why 7 brachot? What is the number 7 allude to? Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Chanafta ben Shaul keneged shiv'a kolot shamar David al hamayim. If you have a look in Mizmor Tehillim Kaftet, which is one of the mizmorim that we say at the end of Kabbalat Shabbat, the word kol Hashem is mentioned 7 times, and that is an allusion to the 7 brachot of Shabbat, and therefore that is included as part of our Kabbalat Shabbat as well. Okay, a different understandings precisely why these mizmorim and not others. You can see that in source number 10 and number 11. Just skip to source number 12 for the moment, so page 199. The Shulchan Aruch mentions another minhag, which we do have here, which is Noagin Lomar Perek Bamei Madlikin, which is the 2nd chapter of Mishnayot of Masechet Shabbat. We say that at the end of Kabbalat Shabbat, just before Maariv. There is an interesting minhag that some have. The minhag in England is to recite Bamei Madlikin. It's at the end of Maariv, right?
Yeah.
I've never been to a place which has, but I believe that there are.
Yeah. So there are many places where it's recited. This was what we used to do was in. Sorry.
I think it did last.
In Kenigsberg, I know in Magen Avot they used to. That was actually once we had we had a chef as a guest speaker, Scotland resident. He was in our shul on Friday night, and he was sitting next to me, and this was in London. And we had the siddur, we finished Kabbalat Shabbat, and started to say Bamei Madlikin. We tell him that the minhag there was say it at the end. Okay, so that is the more common minhag in England. It's a bit strange. It's not really so understandable why you would say Bamei Madlikin at the end when it certainly already is Shabbat. The custom to say it earlier at the end of Kabbalat Shabbat is more intuitive. Because why are we saying it? Because it mentions certain things that we have to do. It talks about the candles that you can use, the wicks and oils that are permitted to use for Shabbat or not. Then at the end it says, the 3 things a person has to remember in one's household to do before Shabbat comes in. So we read Bamei Madlikin, perhaps it's a reminder of to make sure that we do it all. That is so he says, Noagin Lomar Perek Bamei Madlikin, right? והספרדים אומרים אותו קודם תפילת ערבית והוא הנכון. Says the Shulchan Aruch to say it before Maariv, that is the proper practice. Now we don't say Bamei Madlikin on Yom Tov. יש אין אומרים אותו ביום טוב, שחל להיות בערב שבת, ויש אין אומרים אותו בשבת של חנוכה. Says the Rama, ואין נוהגים כן בחנוכה, בשבת של חול המועד, אין אומרים אותו. וכן ביום טוב שחל להיות בשבת, אין אומרים אותו. So when you have Yom Tov, which falls on a Friday, we would not say the chapter of Bamei Madlikin. In footnote number 10, you can see why. It says the reason that on Yom Tov, one would not ask his household whether they separated the tithes. That is one of the things that is mentioned. because on Yom Tov it would be forbidden to do this on Erev Shabbat, right? Yom Tov, which is Erev Shabbat, you can still light the candles. You still have to light the candles. We know there's a way from a pre-existing flame, but Isatim to separate tithes, again, this is not so common nowadays. Most of the produce that we buy from the shop has already had Trumot Masra taken, and we wouldn't do it. But that was the establishment. And therefore, if Yom Tov is on Shabbat as well, even though it's permitted on Friday because of Lo Plug, therefore we don't say it. So that is Bamei Madlikin.
Would it be more honest to say that our minhag is not to recite Bamei Madlikin, but to pretend to do so, given the amount of time which is given for it?
Okay, we can ask that question about many of the things that we say. That's we'll leave that for another time. Okay, Maariv. So we recited Bamei Madlikin, or we've followed along as much as we could, and we now get to, we've done Kabbalat Shabbat, Bamei Madlikin. We now get to Maariv. So until we get to the Amidah Shmona Esrei, which is not a Shmona Esrei, it never is, but that we know is clearly very different. And before that, it's more or less the same, with a couple of notable exceptions. One is in the bracha of Hashkivenu, one of the brachot Kriyat Shema that we say before Tefillat Arvit. And the truth is, sometimes we'll talk about what happens if somebody said the wrong thing. And it's very easy to get confused because the beginning part is so identical. You open up the Siddur to Maariv, it's happened before, right? It's happened to me, that you open up on to Maariv, you start saying Baruch and Birkot Kriyat Shema, and only you get to Hashkivenu, you get to the last, you're just reading along from the Siddur, hopefully you're saying all the words, and you get to the final words of the bracha, and then you think, that didn't sound right. Because the bracha that we say of Hashkivenu, it starts the same, but on Chol, it's different to what we say on Shabbat, as we'll explain why in a moment. But until that point, all of Maariv is the same. So somebody had in the Siddur, somebody was reading along, was only that at that point they noticed they were actually following along Maariv of Chol and not of Shabbat. So what do? We'll see what we do. But first, let's understand why we say it differently. Says the Tur in source number 13, he says, Mishanin b'chatima, we change the end of this bracha, shechotem ufolei sukat shalom aleinu, v'al Yerushalayim milcha. Okay, there are slightly different girsaot, but Baruch Ata Hashem, hapoles sukat shalom aleinu, v'al amo Yisrael, v'al Yerushalayim. That is how we end off. Rather than during the weekday, we end off Shomel amo Yisrael ad. Here we say Shomel, right? I'll never forget in Shivat HaKotel, Rav Adari, the late Rosh Hashanah, used to, as a tzal, he used to daven from the Amud. I think it was the first night of Rosh Hashanah, and he would get to this bracha, and he would say, thinking Rosh Hashanah, thinking what this means, the Sukat Shalom Aleinu Al Kol Yisrael Al Yerushalayim, and it would take him a long time to say the bracha, and it would be in tears. It was something, it was really a sight to comprehend. Always think about get to these words. But in any event, those are the words that we say. And this is Minhag Ashkenaz v'Tzarfat. En chotemin shomei amo Yisrael ad. Why? The Midrash says in the Midrash, "B'Shabbat en tzarchin shmira she'Shabbat shomer." Okay, there is a concept that Shabbat gives us protection in some way, whatever that means, and therefore we don't need to say shomer amo Yisrael in the bracha on Shabbat, but we have a different formula. Now, the Torah tells us another change, which we do not do in the Beit Knesset. So this is important to discuss and understand why it is. And we're not the only place that doesn't do it. There are many places that follow this minhag as well. It's always, I mentioned I was away for Shabbat. Whenever I'm away for Shabbat and Friday night, and they say V'Shamra, it's always strange. It always takes me a moment to realize what's going on, because very, very accustomed to our minhagim.
Because they're wrong.
You say he says v'noagim lama pasuk v'shamru b'nei Yisrael. Okay, you'll see it's printed in the Siddur v'shamru b'nei Yisrael after the bracha of Hashkivenu, before the Kaddish and the Amidah. Lomar she'im yishmuru Shabbat en tzarchim shmira. Says the Torah, we just explained that we don't say the bracha of Shomer amo Yisrael ad because we don't need shmira on Shabbat, because Shabbat provides us with shmirah. So it's Shabbat is what you have to guard, what you have to keep. So therefore we say, there are those who say, V'shamru b'nei Israel, v'hu gam ken me'en geulah. Now this is very important. Let's understand what he's telling us. He says this is also this is a part of Geulah, talking about redemption. Why? She'im yishmu Yisrael shtei Shabbatot miyad nigalin. Okay, the Gemara says, Gemara Shabbat says that if Bnei Israel keep 2 Shabbatot. Many drashot said about this. What does this mean? Which 2 Shabbatot? How 2 Shabbatot? Whatever. But keep 2 Shabbatot and Geulah will come immediately. So why is the Torah tying down this paragraph of Vishamru and saying it's connected to Geulah? The reason is because every day at Shachrit and at Maariv, we have a halacha of Smichat Geulah L'Tfilah. That is why we end off the brachot, Kriyat Shema, with the idea of Geulah, we mention redemption, and then from that we go into our Tfilah. The Gemara asks, how is it? We have an introductory pasuk that we say when we begin our Tfilah, we say Hashem Tzvadai Divnach V'Yagid Dilatecha. So that is part of the Tfilah, that is part of the considered Tfilah Arichta. But we can't have an interruption between Geulah and Tfilah. So says the Torah, you end off Geulah, that's what you discuss in the brachot of Kriyat Shema, and now you're adding in an extra paragraph of Vishamru Bnei Israel. How can that be? He says the reason it can be is because Vishamru is really about Geulah, and therefore it's extending the Geulah, and therefore you can add it in. The Vilna Gaon famously does not accept this. The Vilna Gaon says no, there has to be no interruption between this, and therefore these additions of Vishamru Bnei Israel, one should not say, and on Moadim as well, there are places where instead of Vishamru, they say by Daber Moshe Moed Hashem al Bnei Israel, or on Rosh Hashanah, Tiku B'Chodesh Shafar, etc. So none of that, we don't say that yet, based on the Vilna Gaon, that this is a hefsek between Geulah and Tfilah.
So how did it get in there in the first place? Who put it in?
Well, this is what the Torah explains. This is a machloket. The question is, the minhag was, I don't know, clearly by the Torah's that was already there, and he says the justification for putting it in is that we view it as an extra, as part of Geulah. But the Vilna Gaon said, we don't view it as part of Geulah. We can't add it in, and that is the machloket. So I think there's quite a number of in Chutz La'aretz, I would say, it has a guess, but I would say that it's probably more common that it is said. But in Eretz Israel, again, there are different places, different minhagim, but many places in Yerushalayim would follow minhag agra and would not say Vishamru. Now, regarding Hashkivenu, which we do say, as we mentioned before, source number 14 over the page says the Shulchan Aruch, B'Birkat Hashkivenu eino chotem b'Shomer Amo Yisrael. We don't say the regular conclusion that we say on the weekday. אלא כיוון שהגיעו ובצע כנפך את אסתרנו, אומר, before סוכת שלום עלינו ועל ישלנו. Again, הנוסח is slightly different to that, but ברוך אתה השם הפועל סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל ירושלים. Now, the question is, what happened if you were davening from you opened up the siddur at the wrong place, you didn't realize, or you were just saying it off by heart and just by habit, you said the wrong ending of this bracha. So the Mishnah Berurah says in number 15, he says, person forgot, you said the wrong ending of the bracha. So if you remember immediately, okay, just correct it. What's called toch kedei dibur, which means within a second or two, you remember, I've just said the wrong ending of the bracha. So okay, I can correct myself. We'll see next week when we talk about mistakes a person makes in tefillah. Can happen. You're davening the Amidah, and all of a sudden you realize, you're saying Rafa'enu or whatever it is, and it's on Shabbat, you don't say. Or if you say you begin, and what's interesting, the fourth bracha, this is where the change begins in the Amidah. So in the weekday, it begins with the word atah, and many of the tefillot of Shabbat and Yom Tov also begin with the word atah. So fascinating discussion. What happens if a person said the word atah? They had in mind that they were going to say atah chonantana. So you haven't said anything wrong, but in your head, you were actually going to pray the tefillah of Chol. What do? Do you have to finish that bracha? Can you change? Stay tuned, watch the space, we'll get to that next week. But for now, we're not at the Amidah yet. We're still on the bracha v'ashkivenu. So you said the wrong thing. If it's toch kedei dibur, immediately correct yourself, and that's fine. Now, in bold, v'imshahah kedei dibur, but if you waited the amount of time, toch kedei dibur means the amount of time is to say the words Shalom Alecha Rabbi Omali, which does not take very long, it's a few seconds. But if you waited that long, so you've said the bracha, you can't now go back on yourself because you've already said it, you finished. So you'd have to say a new bracha. But in this case, we say Me'et Siyem Tevat La'ad and not Tzarech La'omro V'lo Yachzor Od Hapam. But Avad, you've said the bracha, it still applies, still bracha of Kriyat Shema, and you would not have to go back. You'd not have to go back and say it. Okay. A central part of our Tfilat Amidah on Friday night is the section of Vayachulu. Vayachulu, we talk about the creation. Shabbat is Zecher L'Maaseh V'Reishit. We mentioned Vayachulu to give testimony, so to speak, to Hashem creating Shemayim V'Aretz. By the way, I think we'll get to it later, but there is a discussion amongst the poskim as to whether one fulfills the mitzvah of Kiddush when one says Vayachulu in the Tefillah on Shabbat. Right? Why? We know we have to say Kiddush al Hayayin, Kiddush on wine, but it's mid-Rabbanan. The Rabbanan established that your Kiddush on Friday night has to be, and in the morning as well, but it has to be over a cup of wine. But Minat Torah, biblically, just to say the word, what does Kadesh Shabbat mean? It means you set it aside, you sanctify it. So by mentioning Vayachulu, talking about what the Shabbat is, that would be enough. That would be sufficient on a Doraita level to fulfill the mitzvah. Right? We've spoken about this once before. Why does this get complicated? Because let's say a man comes to shul and he davens Maariv and he says Vayachulu. He has now fulfilled his obligation of Kiddush on a Doraita level. And he now goes home and his wife has not yet davened or hasn't davened Maariv, and therefore, by not having said Vayachulu, so she is now obligated on a Doraita level to say Kiddush. And he is obligated on a Rabbanan level to say Kiddush. In other words, he's already fulfilled the mitzvah, so now we have a question. Can somebody with a lower level obligation discharge somebody with a higher level obligation? So the poskim talk about Avot, etc. There are those who say, therefore, that one should have in mind to fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush when you say Vayachulu. There are those who say you should not have in mind, you should have in mind not to fulfill the mitzvah. Okay, that is a separate discussion. But what's interesting, so we have Vayachulu, which we say is part of the Amidah, and then we repeat that paragraph, right? Vayachulu, we say it again together as a tzibur after the Amidah. So two reasons are given as to why that is, and we'll see the nafkamina between them. Source number 17 says the Rosh. We say Vayachulu again, right? The word tefillah, generally speaking, in primary sources refers to the Amidah. But we said it in the Amidah, and we now say it again after the Amidah. Why? Hainu. When you have Yom Tov and Shabbat coincide on the same day, the Yom Tov Amidah, we don't say Vayachulu. We say Ata. We mention Shabbat, but we don't say the paragraph of Vayachulu, and therefore Chazal made it that we should say Vayachulu after the Amidah, because of Shabbat that falls on Yom Tov, and out of a low plug we say it every Shabbat as well. Okay, says the Shulchan Aruch as well, brings this, number 18. He says, we go back and we say Vayachulu again. Mishum Yom Tov shechal liot b'Shabbat, she'en omrim oto b'tfilah. Then he adds another reason. V'gam lotzi l'mi she'eno yodea. Also, there are those who don't know how to say it, and we say it to discharge their obligation. And now he adds in something else. He says, we have to say it aloud and we have to say it standing up. Why do we have to say it aloud and standing up? Because the saying Vayachulu is like giving testimony. It's like giving edut to Briat Shamayim V'Aretz. And now the nafkamina that comes out of these two reasons is as follows. If a person did not say Vayachulu with a tzibur, a person was still davening their Amidah. A person is davening their Amidah, and they're still davening, and the tzibur is finished, the chazan has moved on, the chazan has now said Vayachulu. So I've said Vayachulu in my personal Amidah, but I did not say it together with the tzibur afterwards. Do I have to go back and repeat it, or do I have to find someone to say it with me? If the reason that we say Vayachulu after, it's well known, I think it's pretty well known, the idea that it's testimony, right? If it's giving testimony, so in order to go back and give testimony, you can't give testimony by yourself. You need to go and say it together with somebody else. However, if the reason that we're saying Vayachulu, repeating it, is only because of a law plug, because when it's Yom Tov, we don't say Vayachulu in the Amidah, and therefore we have to say Vayachulu afterwards. So I said Vayachulu in the Amidah, no big deal. So right, that's going to be the nafkamina. Says the Taz. In source number 19, it says, we're giving testimony. Right? Witnesses have to stand up. And now he says, it's now in bold, He says an individual praying by themselves who missed out with the tzibur, don't go and say it again because you're just by yourself. You can't give testimony. It says the Taz, if you want to go back and say you should say it in a way that you are not giving testimony, like you're just reading psukim. Right? This reminds us where we have by Hilchot, for example, the Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, we are only allowed to say together with a minyan. So if a person is davening in a place and there's no minyan to say Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, essentially those are just psukim. You can always read psukim, but you should read them like the poskim say. You read them like a koreh Torah, not like tefillah. So says the Taz, the same idea over here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, therefore, that one should endeavor to find somebody else to say it with them. He says, Al kol panim yeh b'shnayim, at least two. There are those who say, don't go back and repeat vayacholo. Not to change one of the brachot, but when you're at that final section, you could say it together. So that is another way of getting around this. Okay. Yeah.
I read that if you're doing Elkan Tzur and the cousin is saying like Kaddish,
Yeah.
you should not say should not. It's really Elkan Tzur.
So yeah, so Kaddish could be different because again that's not actually part of the tefillah. Why he says over here, he says the vayacholu, it's part of what you said. The truth is there are different minhagim, but there's the pasuk that we say at the very end, Yul ratzon ma'afivik yoni b'ida fanecha Hashem tzuri b'god. So there are those you'll see in the Siddurim, it's printed before Elokai Natsur. And some of the poskim recommend that one should say that pasuk before Elokai Natsur. And once I've said that, that is sort of the concluding concluding piece of my tefillah. And even though I'm saying Elokai Natsur, at that point I would be able to answer to the Kaddish. So that's what it would depend on. If one has said that pasuk or not. But it's not said, and probably not answer, although one could be silent and rely on Shomea Ke'oneh. But if one has said that, then one could answer, certainly Amen Yeshmer. Okay. Bracha Me'en Sheva, we mentioned before, this is for David. So Bracha Me'en Sheva, which we say on Friday night, after the Amidah, after Vayachulu, right, we have Magen Avot. It's really 3 paragraphs, right? The first one and the last one is said by the Chazan, and the middle one, Magen Avot, which is said by the entire congregation. Why is it called Bracha Me'en Sheva? Me'en Sheva relates to the seven brachot that we have in the Amidah. So this is kind of like an informal, abridged, almost Chazarat HaShatz. Okay? We don't have Chazarat HaShatz at Maariv. We don't have a repetition of the Amidah. So why all of a sudden do we have this bracha? Says the Gemara in Shabbat, source number 26. Damarava, Yom Tov Shechaliot b'Shabbat. שליח ציבור היורד לפני התיבה הערבית, אינו צריך להזכיר של יום טוב, שאם מלא שבת אין שליח ציבור, יורד ערבית ביום טוב. In other words, what's he talking about? Yeah? He's saying that somebody who comes, the shliach tzibur, who is davening now at the end of the Amidah, in terms of saying this bracha me'ein sheva. We don't have to mention, there is no mention of Yom Tov in it. Even if it's Shabbat and Yom Tov, there's no mention of Yom Tov, because this was established for Shabbat, this was not established for Yom Tov. And then it says that really on Shabbat, you wouldn't really need it. It says, Hatam Badinu, the last two lines of the Gemara, he said, Badinu da'afilu b'Shabbat namilot tzarech. In other words, this is not an intrinsic part of our tefillah. That we don't have a repetition of the Amidah in any way, shape, or form in Maariv. We don't need it. Why do we have this? Rabbananu detakinu mishum sakana. That the rabbis established that because of danger, because of potential danger. How so? Rashi tells us. No, Rashi does not tell us over here. but I think it was written in here somewhere. Yes, sorry, over the page, number 28, the Taz, which is a much later source. This is the Taz, is a commentary on Shulchan Aruch, but in any event, he explains what the Gemara here is talking about. He says, Nitkana mishum sakanat mezikin, because of this danger. What is it? Shebate Knesset shelahem ayu besadot. The times of the Gemara, the Beit Knesset was out in the fields. V'tiknu otam b'shvil bnei adam shema'achalin lavo. Coming late to shul is not a new phenomenon. Doesn't mean it's okay. But it's not a new phenomenon. So in those days, they were worried that people would go, they would leave the city limits. Again, you know, the cities, the areas that were safe were much smaller. You're going outside, you're coming to a shul out in the field. And Chazal were worried that people who came late, so Chazan would finish and everybody would go home and you still davening there. And then when you go home to leave by yourself from the fields, it's very dangerous. And therefore they added in this extra bracha to elongate things so that everybody would finish at the same time.
Do you have any reason why they had it out in the field?
Corona. But you know, if you do that out in the field, you do not say.
Yes, we're going to talk about. Yes, we're going to talk about that exactly. So, but that was just the way it was.
There's also
And,
Makbil during the week, right? There's
What?
in school. There's also Makbil during the week. There's like an extra bracha at the end of Maariv for the same reason.
There
We don't
is-
say here,
yeah,
after
yeah,
Shema
there is-
Yisrael,
yeah, that's
right.
right. That's right. ותקנו אותם בשביל בני אדם שהמאחרים לבוא לבית הכנסת, for the people who came late, שיסיימו תפילתם בעוד ששליח ציבור מעריך, they'll be able to finish. That's another reason why you shouldn't be too long in your tefillah, but they'll be able to finish while the shliach tzibur is still saying this. And that is explained in the Gemara, but we read it out from the Taz. Okay, so says the Shulchan Aruch, number 29. He says, Omer shliach tzibur bracha achat ben sheva. There's 7 fasted bracha. So an individual, based on the logic, we understand why. It's not an intrinsic part of tefillah. So if an individual is praying by themselves, there is no reason, there's no need to say it. Says the Rama, if you want to say it, you know, this is what you've been what you're accustomed to saying every week. You know, during somebody mentioned Corona, we were stuck at home for 2 years and we're davening on Friday night, and we want to have still the same tefillah that we used to. So you want to say it, okay, you can say it, but without the beginning and the ending, so it's not an actual bracha, because the bracha as such was established only for the shliach tzibur. Now, not only does an individual not say it, but even a minyan that is davening in a place that is not a fixed Beit Knesset. Okay, we're going to have to see exactly what the parameters are. But if it's not in the Beit Knesset, then you would not say bracha achat me'ein sheva. So this is a very relevant question that came up during Corona. It comes up all the time on summer camps and things like that. Just the Shabbat where I was now, we were in you're in a hotel and there's a room in the hotel that is designated as a shul, but it's most weeks or some weeks it may not be used. What happens if the shul some hotels have a shul, a room where there's an Aron Kodesh and Sefer Torah, etc. And some hotels, remember once I walked into a hotel, it was in Netanya. And I asked whether my in-laws were staying there, and I asked the person at reception, I said, where is the shul in the hotel? And the guy looked at me and he said, like, who said we have a shul in the hotel? It was a kosher hotel, but he was very offended by it. Okay, so sometimes they just have, if a group is coming and if it's necessary, they make them study together. Olam Chermon or Olam Golan or whatever it is. It becomes every hotel in Israel with the same name. But they put it together. So maybe if there's a Sefer Torah that's considered a fixed shul, and if there's not, it's not considered a fixed shul. And maybe in one you would say Mein Sheva, one you wouldn't. The minhag is generally that whatever the chazan does, everybody says, "Hey, why did he do that?" And then you have a fight about it. That's the minhag. But in any event, says that actually happened the Shabbat as well. So the Rivash, source number 30, he said this is the source, the Shuta Rivash. He says, "Eino renota bebeit chatanim ubeita ever." Okay, again, nowadays our minhag, generally speaking, is that a mourner comes to shul for on Friday night, so that wouldn't happen. But it was in those days. You would have it in a house of mourning or in the house of Beit Chatanim, right, where a wedding has taken place and sheva brachot. So he says there you're davening in the house. You don't say bracha mein sheva. Okay, I'm sure that there would be people who would still come late there, but it's in the house, so you're fine. That's why it was established. Okay, so how far does this go and what are the parameters? Says Shulchan Aruch, number 31. He says, because the reason doesn't apply, right? Quoting the language of the Rivash. Says the Mishnah Berurah, number 32. Perush, you're davening in a house, in a minyan. Okay, obviously, if there's no minyan, you wouldn't say it. We said an individual does not say it, and anything less than a minyan is considered like an individual, right? V'chol sheken otan shemitpalim lefarkim b'minyan b'bayit, aval ksheyesh kviyut al eze yamim v'yesh sefer Torah etzlam kmo b'yiridim domeh lebeit hakneset kavua ve'omrim. So he says, if there is a place where you're going to be for a fixed number of days, he mentions a Sefer Torah. We'll see if Sefer Torah is just incidental or that's what establishes it. But you have a place where you have the minyan and it's fixed, it's established there. So then you would say that becomes like a fixed shul, and then you would say become a sheva. So Magen Avot. So on summer camps, for example, you go on a summer camp and you're there for 2 weeks. And if every day you're using a different room and you're finding a place to daven, so then it's more problematic, or you're davening outside or whatever. We'll talk about Corona minyanim as well. But if you go on a summer camp, we had this in England with B'nai Kibbutz. One of the sites that we used was actually, it was a boarding school. It was a Christian boarding school. So there were all sorts of things on the walls or whatever that we had to cover up. And then that was the first challenge in terms of finding. But once we found a place that was acceptable and there was a room that could be used as the Beit Knesset, so that was the Beit Knesset for the duration of 2 weeks, 3 times a day. You're davening there. That although when we leave, they're going to take everything down off the walls and they're going to, whatever it is, it turns back into being a classroom. You're there for long enough. That's Beit Knesset. And therefore you can say Magen Avot. Okay, does there have to be a Sefer Torah? So Rav Moshe writes here, source number 33, Rav Moshe Feinstein says, "Im yesh lomar b'kat mein sheva b'leil Shabbat makom she'ein Sefer Torah." He says, "Ubeit Knesset kavua letfilat Maariv of Shabbat, ve'af makom kavua b'bayit echad tzarech lomar b'kat mein sheva." So he says that any place which is regularly used for tefillah, so even if there's a Friday night minyan in somebody's home, and it's only Friday night. So presumably the first, if you did the once or twice, you wouldn't say it. But once it becomes a fixed place and it's established that is the Beit Knesset, you would say it. He says it's not required. It's not, a Sefer Torah is one way of knowing that it's a fixed shul. But even if you have a fixed minyan there and there is no Sefer Torah, then that is fine. That would still be considered the Beit Knesset. We had this actually. There was a shul in London where I used to daven, where it was a shul. It was actually a school hall which was used over Shabbatot and Yomim Tovim, but that was the fixed Beit Knesset. There's an Aron Kodesh. There's a shul next door, and during the week and when there's no tefillah taking place, the Sefer Torah is kept in the other Aron Kodesh because there can be locked and then insurance and everything that's going on nowadays. So it would only be on Shabbat morning that before Tefillah, the Gabayim would come in and would bring in the Sefer Torah. Are we going to say that you're standing there and so you might say it's different because there's no Kodesh nonetheless, but there's no Sefer Torah. Clearly that is Beit Knesset, that's Kavua, and you would still say Magen Avot. Be the name of the shul is Magen Avot, but that's another thing. Okay, so there is a discussion regarding Yerushalayim. Piskei Teshuvot writes that it could be, we find a similar discussion by Tachanon as well, because of the Kedusha of Yerushalayim, we say Bekat Mein Sheva in any event, anywhere in the city. Discussion over here, whether that is, Rav Tikuchinsky says, oh no, not so quick. It has to be still a fixed minyan in the city. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says maybe when you say Yerushalayim, again for different halachot, we have to understand. Who says we mean Yerushalayim Ruchavia? Maybe we're talking about Yerushalayim Bein Chomot, which has a certain level of Kedusha, which the rest of the city does not necessarily have. Okay, so that is discussed over there. We do find the many Sephardi poskim. Well, actually, there's a machloket here as well. Yalkut Yosef, source number 36. He says, top of page 211. He says, "Ein l'shliach tzibur lomar b'kat ben sheva ela ach v'rak b'beit knesset b'makom ha'kavua le'tfilah." Right? He says it should be, as we've learned, in a fixed place of prayer. And the Ben Ish Chai, on the other hand, Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, says for mystical reasons that this is something which should always be said wherever you are. So that opinion exists as well. And you can just see the last box at the bottom of page 211, top of page 212, talks about how during COVID, when there were all these house minyanim and garden minyanim and balcony minyanim, etc. So that is not in an informal space. And many questions were asked. You may remember vaguely of that time, but it says, yeah, regarding tefillah in the street, the Piskei Shavot and Shei mentioned that if an entire congregation or its majority is praying together in the street or someplace other than a regular synagogue, meaning that becomes the makom kavua tefillah, then they would say main sheva. And Rav Willig said that a consistent minyan held outside but adjacent and belonging to the shul would also recite bracha main sheva. Okay, if you are more interested in that, you can see there is a separate volume of Summa B'Rabbanan of Halachot of the COVID-19 era. Hopefully that will never be practical again, but that's interesting discussions which exist over there. All right. Should we stop there, or should we do one more? I think we'll stop there. Okay, so we'll pick it up next week. We've finished the night of Shabbat. Now we have to talk about the day. We have to talk about Shachrit, talk about Musaf, talk about what happens when one makes mistakes in the Tefillot, as I mentioned. All of that same time, same place. Next week.